My name is Taylor Riggs. I'm an anchor here at Bloomberg Television. We have an incredible panel for you today. It's called Tracking Gender Equality in the Workplace. Three panelists that I'm so excited to speak with. We have David Kenny, the CEO and Chief Diversity Officer at Nielsen, Sheryl Palmer, the CEO of Taylor Morrison Home Corporation, and Corey Thomas, the CEO of Rapid7. Great to have all three of you here. And Sheryl, I'd love to start with you as we really kick off this panel talking about gender and gender equality in the workplace. And, you know, you're sort of a female CEO in an otherwise male-dominated field. As you think about how you've gotten to where you are, what would be maybe the one key takeaway, one key advice of how you've really gotten to this place?
Well, good morning. Really nice to be here. So thank you for having us. Boy, the one key thing I think is just never losing sight of who I am and who I am as an individual, who I am as a professional. You know, as a female leader in the industry today, and as you said, that's unique in home building. I've never wanted to be known as the female leader, right? Or the single female CEO. It's always about who am I, my work ethic, really how I approach the business, my eye for strategy. And by the way, I happen to be a woman. And I think the more natural that I am with that, the easier it is on, honestly, my peers who maybe haven't had the opportunity or don't have female executive leadership within their organization.
Corey, I wanted to come to you next. As we were talking before the panel started, you've mentioned a great program and initiative that you're a part of called Diversity Hack, which of course brings in people from a young age and then gets them to that place to being leaders. Talk to us about Diversity Hack. It was a great idea.
Yeah, one of the core things that we were focused on, we set a goal about 4 years ago to actually have 50% of our workforce, and that would translate both into leadership at the broader force over time to be able to be women and people of color. And so we have to really think about our funnels and our pipelines. And we had a couple of observations, but specifically when it came, especially to people of color and women of color, we also realized that academic elitism played a bit of a part about the lack of diversity in the pipeline that we were actually seeing. And so we partnered with, a nonprofit organization and several other companies to actually fund and seed a program that went out and actually looked for people from non-traditional backgrounds who were extraordinarily talented, that didn't have the goal, that didn't have the stamp of approval of a Harvard, say, or some of the other schools that we might have been recruiting at, but that it allowed us to actually bring in really, really strong talent that we were not noticing because of our system of how we actually validate and filter things. And what we found is that we actually brought in multiple classes, and these are some of the most talented and valuable people in the organization. And so as we had success, other managers and leaders looked around and said, like, where are you finding this amazing talent in this market? And it made it easier to actually demonstrate that, we had biases even in terms of, so like, just where we went to recruit. And that if you actually break down some of those biases, you could actually access talent that we were just missing overall.
I love that. And David, I think that leads nicely into you. Of course, we both work for companies that are so data driven. I know here at Bloomberg, for example, we do have a accountability tracker, right? Which once you set the goal and set the metric that Corey was just alluding to, if you're accountable and you have the data behind it, you can really see if you're achieving those goals. You're running, a data company effectively. How has some of the data helped you really achieve some of the metrics that you've set out?
Well, it certainly is.
I lost David's audio. Can you hear David?
No, I can't.
Okay. Yeah, David, I see you speaking. We've lost your audio. So I'm going to have another panelist jump in. We're going to work behind the scenes to make sure David's audio comes back. Sheryl, jump in off of what Corey was saying about finding new and innovative ways to be thinking outside the box when it comes to recruiting to really help diverse voices get their foot in the door?
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. And I'll probably be a little contrarian on the subject because I do believe that in the world of recruiting, it starts with the how. And I think we all know that top talent attracts top talent. And I think there's somewhat of this kind of tribal society that we live in, and people like to be surrounded by people like them. So when I think about our organization, we have attracted women, I think, for a number of reasons. One, I think that they know that they can be successful within our organization, and that we've been able to demonstrate that it's about your skill and your performance to continue to develop in your career. And it's an open door talking to executives through the organization. And I don't think it matters if you're talking about gender or ethnicity. People like to know that they have an opportunity, and they also like to be with people like themselves. So I think, to Corey's point, the opportunity to really expand kind of the corporate look in our recruiting efforts is so significant. One of the more recent stats I saw is if corporate America were to just expand the slate. So if you generally will have 3 candidates and you were to go from 3 to 6 and make sure that those other 3 are diverse in any way, then the odds or the ratios would change dramatically. You would go from 1 out of 6 maybe females or diverse hires to 1 out of 4. A significant difference just by putting qualified people in front of you.
Yeah,
Corey,
I
react
love.
to that.
No, I would love to build on it. I think one of the things that Sheryl said that really resonated with me is, in some ways, acknowledging the fact that we are tribal by nature. Because if you don't acknowledge it, you can't really sort of like address it. And I think what Sheryl said was interesting in some ways is that, for me, the first part is that acknowledging and getting people to say, like, listen, it doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. It sort of makes you human. But if we don't actually address the fact that we have a natural bias towards actually idealizing people that look like us and act like us and have our backgrounds and have our pedigree, then that's a problem. And so it's not the human nature, but it's whether we do something about it. And that builds on the further thing is that we have to recognize that if we're actually really going to actually create great workplaces that are diverse and inclusive, it's not about sort of just the 1 or 2. You have to get a critical mass of people so that you can attract more. And so I think it's the and, but I think at every step there's a recognition that there is this human nature towards tribalism. And then we have to say that, like, okay, how do we actually become more than who we are today?
Yeah.
And don't you believe, Corey? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Sheryl, jump in. I love this.
I was just going to ask Corey, don't you believe, it feels like this whole concept of unconscious bias is, kind of this buzzword. But I do believe there truly is, in this form of tribalism, there truly is this unconsciousness. Not everybody. I think there is conscious bias out there. And that's what we as leaders in our organizations have to really work to help people understand the benefits and stuff. And like you said, to get the mass, and then the results begin to speak for themselves. But I do believe that there is a very unconscious kind of old habit forming bias of just being comfortable in people that act or look like you. And the more that we can just let that organically evolve, and maybe with some targets, and there's different ways to get there, I think it's just so healthy. And certainly the results, there's so many facts out there that talk about the impact of corporate America when we get this diversity of thought in a much better place than where we are today.
I'm going to jump in and ask if we have David yet. I don't think so. So I think we're going to keep going. David, can you hear us? Well, let's keep going. We'll pull him back into the conversation when he comes back. It's so interesting as we think about where we are in this pandemic, you guys. Jay Powell yesterday, the chair of the Federal Reserve, was talking a lot about ignoring inflation and really focusing on employment and really the disparities within employment. After this pandemic, we've seen women and we've seen people of color, Blacks, Hispanics be hit really the hardest. And the drop in unemployment hasn't been as fast for them as it has been for white men. How are you guys thinking in a post-pandemic world to support women, to support people of color, to make sure that they are coming back to the workforce and getting the support that they need? Sheryl, maybe I'll let you start off that conversation.
Taylor, thank you for the opportunity for us to talk about it, because it's such a critical time. If we think, to your point, about the damage or the change that's been done in just 12 months. I mean, in January of this year, we had 10 million mothers of school-aged children who were not working. That's compared to about 8.5 million a year earlier. So, I mean, the impact is so great. And we know all the reasons for it. We know that women have been disproportionately affected because of childcare and medical and all kinds of things. But it's in a place today that I think we haven't seen numbers this low dating back to the 80s. So, I mean, from our perspective, we're not really changing what we do. Certainly during the pandemic, you had to have a great sense of understanding about the impacts and how every family was affected through the pandemic differently, and making sure that we had the support for our team members across the organization to help them through this difficult time. But I look at our organization today, and I'll be honest, I'm so proud. We're about close to a 50-50 split between men and women. It's actually about 53-47%. And when I look at what happened to us through the pandemic, we kept our ratios pretty pure. I mean, we had about 43-44% of our promotions through the last year were female. When I look at the folks we've hired, wow, same thing, in the low 40% of our organization was female. When I look at the compensation, and so that's a huge driver, is making sure that this is front and center and that we understand, equal pay is about doing, the same job. But when I look at our highest paying team members, it's over 40% are women. So really it's about not talking about it, but walking it.
Corey, as you think about labor dynamics in a post-COVID world, how are you thinking about bringing back a workforce, a diverse workforce that is supported, even if people are working from home or what be it?
Yeah, one, I echo the points about there's so much data that indicates that the fall off or the participation rates of women in the workforce have really been hit hard by it. I have similar data as Sheryl on sort of like our employee base, and we've been watching it hard, and we've tried to make sure that there was lots of flexibility. Although even in our internal surveys, we actually see that the burden of homeschooling and childcare falls disproportionately around. So part of it is not just these structural things, it's these social cues that we actually have to make okay, to say it's okay to turn off your video in meetings. It's okay to actually have interrupts. And I remember sort of like one distinct thing, my son interrupted me doing a town hall or some meeting, and I was just like, Ethan, get out the way, and stuff like that. And I got a note from someone who was actually said, hey, Corey, I know you spend a lot of time, but like, what would be awesome is if you didn't make it feel like it was a bad thing for your son to interrupt you. And that really stuck with me about the own behavior. So, we talked about it at executive level and said, listen, we have to normalize things that might not traditionally be normal, so that it actually feels like it's truly inclusive, and the definition of inclusivity can change. The second thing I would highlight is that my company is not typical. I do think it's worthwhile to call out that when we think about sort of like recovering from this, we do have to acknowledge that tech companies and lots of other corporations did fare much better throughout this versus the service economy. And so when we think about sort of like, we look at it two ways: is what are our own policies, of which we're going to have a lot more flexibility as we actually this, but also we actually have to actually play a much more active role in advocating for our employees and for the broader community. And so we're part of a group of companies and groups that came together that really, in the state of Massachusetts at least, and said, listen, we have to really look structurally at childcare. And what we have today just doesn't fundamentally work. and advocate for changes and invest in changes around that infrastructure. So I think that there's both things that we do as companies, but I think we have to redefine coming out of COVID what we consider our communities, because I do think companies, as we've globalized, have become more disassociated from communities, and I think that's one of the change that has to occur.
Sheryl, how are you thinking about that? Well, I'm just off the top of my head, you do hear about tech companies looking at bringing in childcare in the lobby, or being more supportive of women who have to leave early to pick a kid up from school. I mean, are there specific policies that your team has been looking at or implemented to make sure that there really is that type of flexibility that maybe women need?
Yeah, Taylor, it's all of the above. And there's not one silver bullet here, but I think, and this might not sound real popular, but if you think about just kind of the biases over the years, I think women in the workforce, so some of it is kind of, I think, self-inflicted, but women in the workforce would talk about, why would it be okay for a man to leave, late in the afternoon to go coach a baseball team, but I felt bad about leaving to go take my child to the doctor. I think you have to just neutralize all that and say that you've got a personal and a professional life, and we're there to support you. And it's about getting your job done. And it's not about a 9 to 5. So through COVID, it was so many different things. It was, how did we help you at home? How did we make sure your office environment at home was okay? How did we give you flex hours? How did we make, a hybrid approach so that you could deal with homeschooling, really all the things that I think, to Corey's point, women were disproportionately impacted with. And, they were juggling a lot. And in some instances, we actually had to shore up our team because we recognized the impacts on some of our female workforce and their availability. So I think part of it's just an attitude. I really do. I think part of it women have to own and say, you have the same ability to do your job and do it in the hours that make sense. Certain things have to be done during business hours, not all things, but allow for that flexibility, person by person, role by role. And then I think, to Corey's other point, as we look forward, the world is changing, and we're having to go through I don't know yet what the exact answer is on what our future hybrid workforce looks like, because I do tend to have a bias that team, culture requires personal social interaction. And you can maybe retain relationships on Zoom, but it's hard to build new ones. It's just not the same. But we have to do that with a recognition of the impacts and the obligations of our entire workforce. And it's really about organically understanding what's important to the team. So we spend a lot of time talking to our team, to understanding the impacts and what's important to them, to have that kind of personal, professional balance in their life.
Corey, I wanted to pivot a little bit to talk about mentoring. Just speaking from a personal level, I've had great female and male mentors as well, but maybe it's helpful for females to have more female mentors as well. How are you thinking about mentorships to make sure that you do a great job of diversity from an initial hiring, but maintaining that up through middle management, through upper management as well? How much of that really comes down to a mentoring program?
Well, I think mentoring and sponsorship are both essential. Mentorship is about the time that you actually spend with people, building a connectionship and a relationship, and coaching and advising. But sponsorship is actually you're really helping them accelerate their career on one hand, but you're helping provide opportunities, you're helping create opportunities. And I think they both are essential. I think it's less the program, though. And so I'll say a couple things. One is I completely echo the points about in-person does matter, because it's hard to build connections completely over Zoom that are actually valued. So I think that's key. When I think about what's important is to acknowledge that you have some natural networks of which mentorship and sponsorship occur naturally. And what I'm hunting for is not a program that's one size fit all. What I'm typically looking for is who are the people and what are the backgrounds and what are the cases where the mentorship and sponsorship are not happening naturally. and what are the causes of that, and what are the drivers of that. So, I give you an example is that while we definitely have it, and we've had it in certain cases with women and people of color, we've also had it with remote employees because we're pretty much in person, so we only have 10% of the remote, and so that's been a gap. And so when I'm trying to address mentorship specifically, I'm trying to figure out like who does not have the mentorship opportunity available, and then how do we build that? Now, on your specific question about both programmatically and how do you think about sort of like the gender male female, I encourage people to not think about a mentor as a guru, as a single person. Is to really build a wide set of connections with people at different levels of careers that they're mentoring or that they are sort of like being mentored by and with, and that should both be people that actually it's easy for you to actually do. And so if you're a woman, that may be a woman. If you're a black person, maybe a black person, but where that comes naturally, and also ones where it's actually less easier to do. And on the flip side, what I find is that we have people at every level who want to be mentored. So I have managers and directors and vice presidents who want to be mentored. And in turn, when I go back to them and say, like, okay, you're doing this, who are you mentoring and who are you developing? Because everyone, and so even our entry level employees, when they come into the building, is, the first thing that we do when we set them up is to actually say, all right, you're doing a project as a cohort and you're going to be working with high school students, because you too should actually be mentoring people along the way. But you have to create this network of I am mentoring and I'm developing and I'm trying to provide opportunities for people that it's easy to, but also where it's hard and not natural. And if you do that repeatedly, I actually think that's what allows you to actually really build high performance and diverse companies.
I love that. That really forces you to go outside the box. Sheryl, we have about 3 minutes left. I would love for you to comment and respond to that and the mentoring question.
I just so agree with everything Corey said that, the opportunities have to be more natural, in my opinion. So, to Corey's point, we do mentoring at every level of the organization, and that comes through formal and informal sessions. It comes through best practice sessions. It just comes through building relationships, contact. And the bottom line is if you have an organization that, in my opinion, is gender blind, colorblind, and the mentality around the organization is about developing people, developing the best, coming in every day because you have a purpose in what you're doing, then it becomes a much more organic, fed, natural environment. And that's a really healthy place to be. Obviously, you're going to support it with very formal programs, but the more you can let that build from the team and that they're craving it, I think the better organization you have.
We have 2 minutes left. Why don't I each give you about 45 seconds for a final thought? Corey, is there any other final thought you'd like to give to our audience?
I think one of the questions, as you can imagine, with the social justice, I would say awakening that's actually happening last year, there's been lots of discussions. I've been lots of discussions. For me, I think the biggest thing I would just encourage people to actually think through is that there's real problems today, and some of them are intentional and some of them are unintentional. But I also think they're hugely solvable. And my belief is that if we focus on steady and consistent progress, and we take a long-term view of things, then we can actually have high-performing organizations and a great society that we all aspire to. And
Yeah.
that's an achievable thing, but does take steady progress, study and attention, self-awareness, and I think it's the consistency and the focus, and being willing to be a little uncomfortable that I think is what sort of like creates greatness in general.
Sheryl, 30 seconds. Final thoughts?
Final thought. First of all, thanks for having us. And I would say that I couldn't agree more that we're in a very challenging time and that there's a great need for very intentional focus on both gender, equality, kind of just all the social dynamics we've been talking about. But what I don't want to get lost in this is that we can't leave behind skill qualifications. And sometimes when we have quotas, and we can enter into a very long debate, Taylor, about, board seats and what NASDAQ is doing and California new laws. But if we could really focus on expanding our lens, on making sure we understand the talent that's out there, and we get rid of those unnatural biases, and we really promote, develop, hire based on skill, a lot of this does take care of itself. And you don't have the unintended consequences of just hitting quotas with people that maybe aren't really qualified.
Well, great final thoughts. We are still in the day of technology, and we lost David Kenny, the CEO and Chief Diversity Officer of Nielsen, but his loss meant that we got a lot more time with you, Sheryl, and you, Corey. So I'm grateful for the extra time that the two of you gave me today. And thank you so much for joining. Let's do this next year in person.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Nice to see you, Corey. Thank you.
Make sure
Bye-bye.
to stay with us for our further coverage here of our Bloomberg Equality Summit. I'm Taylor Riggs.